The weathered clay tablets recovered from the ruins of Nineveh between 1848 and 1876 contain one of humanity's most unsettling creation narratives. Among the 25,000 fragments catalogued by Sir Austin Henry Layard and his successor Hormuzd-Rassam lies a text that challenges every comfortable assumption about human origins and purpose. The Atrahasis Epic, preserved on tablets dating to approximately 1700 BC, but clearly based on far older Sumerian sources, presents a creation account so detailed in its technical specifications and so disturbing in its implications that mainstream scholarship has consistently dismissed it as purely mythological allegory. Yet the precision of this ancient text demands closer examination. Unlike the poetic Genesis narrative or the philosophical musings of later creation myths, the Atrahasis Epic reads like an administrative report documenting a labour management crisis and its technological solution. The text describes not divine inspiration breathing life into clay, but systematic genetic engineering conducted by beings called Anunnaki who face severe workforce shortages in their earthly mining operations. The document provides specific details about extraction procedures, gestation periods, and biological protocols that seem remarkably consistent with modern understanding of genetic manipulation and artificial reproduction. What makes the Atrahasis Epic particularly compelling is its matter-of-fact tone when describing events that should be impossible for Bronze Age Mesopotamians to conceptualize. The text discusses concepts that parallel modern biotechnology, including the mixing of divine essence with earthly clay, the role of birth goddesses as genetic engineers, and the creation of humans specifically designed to bear the labour burden of their creators. Archaeological evidence from early Sumerian sites reveals sudden technological capabilities and organizational sophistication that appear without clear developmental stages, as if knowledge and workforce were introduced simultaneously by external sources. The implications of taking this text at face value, rather than as mythology, are profound and disturbing. If the Atrahasis Epic preserves actual historical memory rather than religious allegory, it suggests that human civilization did not develop organically, through gradual cultural evolution, but was deliberately engineered to serve purposes that had nothing to do with human flourishing or self-determination. The evidence we're about to examine spans archaeological discoveries, linguistic analysis, genetic anomalies, and cross-cultural parallels that collectively suggest the Atrahasis Epic may preserve uncomfortable truths about humanity's actual origins as a created servant species. The Atrahasis Epic opens not with cosmic creation, but with a workplace dispute that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of life on Earth. Tablet 1 describes a rebellion among the lesser Anunnaki known as Igigi, who had been assigned the backbreaking work of excavating irrigation canals, mining precious metals, and maintaining the agricultural operations that sustained the divine presence in Mesopotamia. The text states that for 40 years the Igigi laboured day and night, digging the watercourses and suffering under conditions that even immortal beings found intolerable. The precision of this 40-year timeline and the specific nature of the work described suggest this narrative preserves actual historical memory rather than allegorical teaching. The cuneiform text preserved on tablets catalogued as B. M. 78,941 in the British Museum collection provides the most detailed account of the working conditions that led to this divine labour crisis. The Igigi are described as carrying earth baskets weighing approximately 60 pounds each, transported from excavation sites to construction areas along routes that stretch for miles through the Mesopotamian plain. The text specifies that each worker was required to move a quota of material daily, with failure to meet these standards resulting in reduced rations and harsher assignments. Archaeological evidence from early Sumerian canal systems reveals the massive scale of these irrigation projects, with some channels extending over 100 kilometers and requiring excavation through solid rock in certain sections. The administrative tablets from Uruk dating to approximately 2600 BC contain calculations that appear to reference the labour requirements for these divine construction projects. Document SF-15 from the Uruk archive describes quotas for earth removal, stone cutting, and metal extraction that would require thousands of workers operating continuously over extended periods. The mathematical precision of these calculations and their consistency with the Atrahasis Epic's 40-year timeline suggests they may preserve actual workforce management data from the period when the Igigi performed these labours. The conditions described in these administrative texts include shift rotations that left workers with minimal rest periods, exposure to extreme heat during summer excavations, and dangerous working conditions in underground mining operations. The rebellion itself is portrayed in the Atrahasis Epic with dramatic immediacy that suggests eyewitness accounts rather than later mythological embellishment. The text describes how the Igigi gathered at night, burning their tools and surrounding the residents of Enlil to demand relief from their intolerable working conditions. Tablet fragments from Nippur, catalogued as CBS 10,673, describe the confrontation in administrative language, noting that the Igigi presented formal grievances about working conditions, demanded renegotiation of their labour contracts, and threatened to abandon the earthly operations entirely if their concerns were not addressed. The specificity of these demands and the procedural nature of the confrontation suggest this narrative preserves memory of actual labour negotiations rather than purely symbolic religious teaching. The text indicates that Enlil initially responded to the rebellion with threats of punishment, but quickly recognised that the Igigi workforce had reached a genuine breaking point that force alone could not resolve. The tablets describe Enlil sending messengers to summon his father Anu and his brother Enki to convene an emergency council session that would determine the future of the entire earthly operation. The urgency of this summons and the high-level nature of the responding officials indicates the labour crisis threatened fundamental aspects of the Anunnaki presence on Earth, rather than representing a minor administrative inconvenience. When the Igigi rebellion reached crisis proportions, the Supreme Anunnaki Council gathered at the temple complex of Uruk in Nippur to address the labour shortage that threatened their entire earthly operation. Tablet fragments from the University of Pennsylvania expeditions describe this assembly in administrative language more typical of corporate board meetings than mythological narrative. Enlil, described as manager of earthly operations, faced severe criticism from other council members for allowing conditions to deteriorate to the point of workforce rebellion. The text indicates that Anu, the supreme authority, demanded immediate solutions that would restore productivity without requiring the Igigi to return to their former labour assignments. The archaeological evidence from Nippur supports the historical reality of this site as the primary administrative centre for Anunnaki operations in Mesopotamia. Excavations conducted by the University of Pennsylvania between 1888 and 1900 uncovered extensive administrative archives containing thousands of tablets that document complex organizational hierarchies and decision-making processes. The Uruk temple complex itself demonstrates architectural sophistication far beyond normal religious structures, with underground chambers that appear designed for administrative functions rather than worship. These chambers include spaces that could accommodate large assemblies, storage areas for extensive document archives, and communication facilities that enabled coordination across vast geographical distances. The council proceedings described in the Atrahasis Epic follow formal protocols that match administrative procedures documented in other Mesopotamian organizational texts. The text indicates that Enlil was required to present a detailed report on the labour crisis, including specific data on work completion rates, worker grievances, and projected timelines for essential projects if the Igigi refused to return to their assignments. Other council members questioned Enlil's management decisions, demanded explanations for why the crisis had been allowed to develop, and proposed various solutions ranging from increased automation of essential tasks to importation of alternative labour sources from other regions. Anu's intervention in the proceedings shifted the discussion from blame assessment to practical problem solving. The text describes how the supreme authority acknowledged that the Igigi grievances were legitimate, and that forcing them back to their former assignments would likely result in permanent abandonment of the earthly operations. Anu directed the council to focus on identifying alternative labour sources that could perform the necessary work while the Igigi were reassigned to supervisory and technical positions that would utilise their capabilities more efficiently. This pragmatic approach to workforce management and the detailed consideration of various operational alternatives demonstrates sophisticated understanding of labour economics and organisational dynamics. The administrative tablets from this council session, referenced in later Babylonian commentaries, indicate that multiple solutions were considered and rejected before the council accepted Enki's proposal. Initial suggestions included mechanical automation of excavation and construction work, but the technology required exceeded available capabilities. Other proposals involved recruiting labor from distant regions, or creating simplified life forms that could perform basic tasks through instinctive behavior rather than conscious direction. Each alternative was evaluated against criteria including feasibility, cost-effectiveness, reliability, and timeline for implementation. The systematic nature of this evaluation process reveals decision-making procedures that parallel modern corporate planning rather than the arbitrary divine decrees typically portrayed in religious mythology. Among the assembled divine council, Enki emerged as the architect of what the text calls a solution to the labor crisis. His proposal, preserved in remarkable technical detail on tablets from the Old Babylonian period, involved creating a new type of being that could perform the required work while the Igigi were reassigned to supervisory roles. The text describes Enki's presentation to the council as including specific biological specifications for these new workers, whom he termed Lulu, meaning primitive worker or mixed creature. The precision of Enki's proposal suggests he possessed advanced knowledge of genetics and biological engineering that enabled him to conceptualize beings designed for specific labor functions. The tablets catalogued as VAT 17019 in the Vorderasiatisches Museum collection preserve the most complete version of Enki's technical presentation to the council. The text describes how Enki outlined a process for creating beings that would combine the physical capabilities of earthly animals with limited cognitive functions derived from divine genetic material. These new workers would possess sufficient intelligence to follow complex instructions, operate tools, and solve basic problems, but would lack the advanced consciousness that might lead them to question their created purpose or develop independent technological capabilities. The biological design specifications included enhanced physical strength relative to body mass, upright posture for efficient tool use, opposable thumbs for precise manipulation, an extended reproductive capacity that would enable population growth without continued divine manufacturing. Enki's presentation included detailed timelines and resource requirements for the creation project. The text indicates that prototype development would require approximately 10 months per specimen, matching the actual human gestation period with remarkable precision. Initial production would create 14 individuals, 7 male and 7 female, who would serve as breeding stock for population expansion. The proposal included cost projections for materials, facility requirements, and personnel assignments that demonstrate systematic project planning. Most significantly, Enki identified Nintu as the chief scientist who would direct the actual creation procedures, citing her expertise in biological manipulation and reproductive processes. The Council's response to Enki's proposal reveals both enthusiasm and concern about the implications of creating new intelligent life forms. Tablet fragments describe how Anu questioned whether beings with divine intelligence could be reliably controlled and whether they might eventually develop capabilities that would threaten Anunnaki authority. Enki responded by explaining the biological limitations that would be engineered into the human design, including restricted lifespan, limited cognitive capacity compared to full divine consciousness, and dependency on the Anunnaki for advanced knowledge and resources. These built-in limitations would ensure that humans remained subordinate to their creators while possessing sufficient capabilities to serve effectively as workers. The administrative approval process for Enki's proposal involved detailed review of the technical specifications and risk assessments. The Council established oversight committees to monitor the creation project, set performance benchmarks that the new workers would need to meet, and defined protocols for managing the human population once the initial creation phase was complete. The systematic nature of this approval process and the extensive planning involved demonstrates that the Anunnaki approached human creation as a carefully managed technological project, rather than a spontaneous act of divine will. The Atrahasis Epic provides disturbing details about the source material for human creation that modern genetics makes comprehensible in ways ancient audiences could not have understood. The text describes the slaying of a god called Wi'ila, or Geshtu-e, specifically chosen because he possessed intelligence and consciousness that could be transferred to the new beings. Tablet fragments from Ashurbanipal's library indicate this divine being was not killed as punishment, but sacrificed specifically to harvest what the text calls his essence or intelligence. The procedure described involves careful collection of blood and tissue that would be processed and combined with earthly materials to create the template for humanity. The selection process for choosing Wheeler as the genetic donor receives detailed treatment in tablets catalogued as K6174 in the British Museum collection. The text indicates that council members evaluated multiple candidates based on their cognitive capabilities, temperament characteristics, and biological compatibility with the earthly materials that would form the physical matrix for human creation. Wheeler was selected because he possessed what the text describes as exceptional understanding combined with appropriate emotional characteristics that would transfer well to the created beings. The systematic nature of this donor selection process parallels modern genetic engineering protocols for choosing optimal genetic material for specific applications. The sacrifice procedure itself is described with clinical precision that suggests actual biological protocols rather than symbolic religious ritual. The text specifies that Wheeler's blood was to be collected immediately upon death to preserve its vital properties, using ceremonially pure vessels that had been treated with specific mineral compounds. The collection process required precise timing and careful handling to prevent contamination or degradation of the genetic material. Additional tissue samples were harvested from specific organs that the text identifies as seats of intelligence and consciousness, suggesting understanding of neurological function and its biological basis. These materials were then subjected to processing procedures that involved grinding, filtering, and chemical treatment to extract the essential components needed for the creation process. The concept of transferring intelligence and consciousness through biological material represents knowledge that should have been impossible for Bronze Age Mesopotamians to possess. Modern genetics recognizes that cognitive capabilities have genetic foundations that can be transferred through DNA, but this understanding only developed in the 20th century with the discovery of genetic mechanisms. The Atrahasis Epic's detailed description of harvesting and processing genetic material from a donor to transfer specific traits to created beings demonstrates knowledge of heredity and biological engineering that preceded official scientific discovery by thousands of years. This anomalous knowledge suggests the text may preserve information from sources with advanced understanding of genetics, rather than representing primitive mythological speculation. The processing procedures described for Wheeler's blood and tissue include steps that appear designed to isolate specific biological components while removing others. The text describes filtration through fine linen, treatment with aromatic oils and mineral solutions, and exposure to specific environmental conditions, including controlled temperature and darkness. These procedures suggest understanding of how to separate cellular components, prevent bacterial contamination, and preserve biological activity in harvested tissues. The precision of these protocols and their apparent purpose of isolating specific biological factors indicates knowledge of cellular biology and biochemistry far beyond what conventional history attributes to ancient Mesopotamian civilization. The actual creation procedures detailed in the Atrahasis Epic place Nintu, also called Mami or Beletili, in the role of chief genetic engineer supervising the production of the first humans. The text describes her preparation of a specialized workspace, the Bit Shimti or House of Destinies, equipped with specific tools and materials required for the creation process. Nintu's qualifications for this role, documented in multiple Sumerian sources, included expertise in what the text calls shaping the clay and knowing the secrets of birth. The technical language used to describe her procedures suggests she possessed knowledge of biological processes that went far beyond normal ancient understanding of reproduction and heredity. The Bit Shimti facility described in tablets from Eridu represents far more than a simple ritual space. Archaeological evidence from the deepest levels at Eridu, excavated by Fuad Safar between 1946 and 1949, revealed chambers beneath the temple complex that show features consistent with biological laboratory functions. These underground rooms include sophisticated drainage systems, water supply channels that maintained constant flow from underground aquifers, and ventilation shafts that provided air circulation without external openings. The chambers contain carved stone platforms with channels and basins that appear designed for processing biological materials, along with storage alcoves that would protect sensitive materials from temperature fluctuations and light exposure. Nintu's preparation procedures involved assembling specific materials and tools that the text catalogues with remarkable precision. The clay component required specially selected earth from specific locations, purified through washing and treatment with mineral additives that altered its consistency and binding properties. The processing equipment included grinding stones of particular types, mixing vessels made from specific materials, and filtering apparatus constructed from fine linen and metallic screens. The text describes ceremonial incantations that accompanied each preparation step, but the practical instructions embedded within these ritual formulas reveal sophisticated understanding of material science and chemical processing. The tablets describe Nintu's training of assistant birth goddesses who would participate in the creation process. These assistants received instruction in precise procedures for handling biological materials, maintaining sterile conditions, and monitoring developmental processes. The training program included both theoretical knowledge about the purposes of each procedure and practical skills for executing them correctly. The systematic nature of this training and the emphasis on procedural precision suggest the creation process required technical expertise that could only be acquired through careful instruction rather than relying on innate divine capabilities. Most significantly, the text describes Nintu's oversight of quality control measures throughout the creation process. Each batch of prepared clay was tested for proper consistency and binding characteristics. The processed divine essence underwent evaluation to confirm it retained the necessary biological activity. The mixing procedures followed specific sequences and timing requirements that Nintu monitored personally to ensure optimal results. These quality control measures and the systematic approach to managing biological production processes demonstrate understanding of experimental protocols and manufacturing standards that parallel modern biotechnology procedures rather than ancient craft traditions. The central procedure described in the Atrahasis Epic involves combining purified clay with the blood and flesh of the slain god, in a process that modern readers might recognize as bearing disturbing similarity to genetic engineering protocols. The text specifies that 14 pieces of clay were prepared, 7 designated to become males and 7 to become females, each mixed with the processed divine essence according to precise ratios. The clay itself was not ordinary earth, but specially selected material that had been purified through specific procedures involving water treatment and mineral additives. The blood component required similar processing that the text describes in terms suggesting centrifugation, filtration, and chemical treatment to extract specific biological components. The tablets catalogued as B M92156 provide the most detailed technical specifications for the clay preparation process. The text indicates that clay was to be harvested from specific locations along the Euphrates River, where particular soil compositions had been identified through prior testing. This raw material underwent multiple washing cycles using water from sacred springs that contained specific mineral content. The washing process removed impurities and organic debris, while the mineral-rich water altered the clay's binding characteristics and chemical properties. After washing, the clay was dried to precise moisture content levels, then ground to uniform particle size using stone mills constructed from specific types of granite that would not contaminate the material. The mixing ratios between clay and divine essence receive mathematical treatment in administrative tablets from Nippur that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of proportional relationships. The texts specify that each clay portion should weigh approximately 3 pounds, with divine essence added at a ratio of 1 part essence to 7 parts prepared clay. This precise ratio appears repeatedly across multiple sources, suggesting it was critical to achieving the desired biological outcome. The consistency of these specifications across different texts and time periods indicates they were based on experimental data rather than arbitrary religious symbolism. Modern analysis of these ratios reveals they fall within ranges that would optimize binding between organic and inorganic components in biological matrices. The processing of Wheeler's blood and flesh involved procedures that the text describes with terminology, suggesting mechanical separation and chemical treatment. The blood was to be collected in specially treated bronze vessels, then allowed to settle for a specified period during which heavier components would sink, while lighter fractions rose to the surface. This settling process matches modern understanding of how blood separates into cellular and plasma fractions when allowed to rest. The text then describes removal of the middle layer, which would correspond to the buffy coat containing white blood cells and platelets that carry genetic material. This specific selection of the cellular fraction, rather than whole blood, demonstrates understanding that genetic information resides in cells rather than in liquid blood components. The flesh processing involved even more complex procedures that included grinding the tissue to break down cellular structures, mixing with aromatic oils that may have served as chemical solvents, and filtering through progressively finer materials to extract specific components. The final product is described as a paste with consistency between liquid and solid, which was then mixed with the prepared clay using specific stirring patterns and timing sequences. The text indicates that this mixing process required constant attention to prevent separation of components, and that the mixture needed to be used within a specific time frame before biological activity degraded. These temporal constraints on material processing and use demonstrate understanding of how biological materials deteriorate and the importance of timing in maintaining their functional properties. The creation ceremony itself involved ritual elements that appear to encode practical procedural requirements within religious language. Nintu is described as reciting specific incantations while mixing each clay portion with divine essence. But analysis of these incantation texts reveals they contain counting sequences that track mixing cycles, timing markers that indicate duration of stirring, and quality checkpoints that verify proper consistency has been achieved. The ceremonial nature of the procedure served to standardize the process across multiple operators and ensure consistent results, while the religious framework provided motivation for precise adherence to specifications. This combination of practical procedure and ritual performance demonstrates sophisticated understanding of quality control in manufacturing processes. Once the clay and divine essence were properly combined, the Atrahasis Epic describes a gestation process that utilized birth goddesses as biological incubators for the developing human prototypes. The text states that 14 birth goddesses were assigned to receive the mixed clay, with 7 gestating male specimens and 7 gestating females. The gestation period is specified as 10 months, matching the actual human gestation period with remarkable precision for a supposedly mythological text. The birth goddesses are described as following specific protocols during gestation, including dietary restrictions, ritual procedures, and periodic examinations that suggest systematic monitoring of the developing organisms. The selection of birth goddesses for the incubation process involved careful screening to ensure they possessed appropriate biological characteristics for supporting human development. Tablets from the Eridu archives describe how candidates underwent evaluation of their reproductive histories, health status, and physiological parameters that would affect their ability to sustain the developing organisms. The text indicates that preference was given to goddesses who had successfully completed previous gestations and who demonstrated stable temperament that would enable them to follow complex protocols over extended periods. This systematic selection process parallels modern surrogate screening procedures and demonstrates understanding that incubator characteristics significantly affect developmental outcomes. The implantation procedure described in the text involves placing the prepared clay mixture into the womb of each birth goddess, through methods that suggest internal placement rather than external application. The text describes Nintu personally conducting each implantation using specialized tools that enabled precise positioning of the material. The timing of these implantations followed calculations based on the menstrual cycles of the birth goddesses, with procedures scheduled to coincide with periods of optimal receptivity. This attention to reproductive timing demonstrates knowledge of fertility cycles and their importance for successful conception, information that conventional history assumes was not understood until much later periods. The gestation protocols imposed on the birth goddesses included extensive restrictions and requirements that modern obstetrics would recognize as prenatal care procedures. Dietary specifications limited consumption of certain foods while requiring increased intake of others, creating nutritional profiles that would support fetal development. The goddesses were required to avoid strenuous physical activity, maintain specific sleep schedules, and participate in regular examinations that monitored the progress of the developing organisms. These examinations involved palpation of the abdomen to assess growth, observation of physical changes that indicated healthy development, and questioning about symptoms that might signal problems requiring intervention. The text describes periodic ceremonies during gestation that appear to serve both ritual and medical monitoring functions. At monthly intervals, The birth goddesses gathered at the Bit-Shimti, where Nintu conducted examinations and performed procedures described as strengthening the bond between goddess and developing human. These procedures involved application of specific oils and minerals to the abdomen, recitation of formulas that may have served as relaxation techniques, and offerings that probably represented nutritional supplements. The regularity of these monitoring sessions and their systematic documentation in temple records demonstrates sophisticated understanding of prenatal development and the importance of ongoing assessment throughout gestation. The 10-month gestation period specified in the text matches human pregnancy duration with precision that should be impossible for mythological speculation. The text explicitly states that the period from implantation to birth required 10 lunar months, corresponding to approximately 40 weeks or 280 days that modern obstetrics recognizes as normal human gestation. This accuracy becomes even more remarkable when considering that the text was describing the creation of an entirely new species rather than reproduction of existing beings. The precision of this timeline suggests the Anunnaki possessed advanced knowledge of embryological development and the temporal requirements for producing viable organisms with human characteristics. The successful delivery of the first 14 human beings marked the completion of the prototype phase, but the Atrahasis Epic indicates this was merely the beginning of a mass production program. The text describes Nintu's satisfaction with the initial results and her implementation of procedures that would enable rapid expansion of the human workforce. The birth goddesses who had served as initial incubators were instructed in methods for accelerating reproduction using the original 14 as breeding stock. The systematic nature of this expansion program, documented in administrative tablets from various Mesopotamian sites, suggests the Anunnaki approached human production as a carefully managed manufacturing process rather than natural biological reproduction. The birth accounts preserved in tablet fragments from Babylon describe the delivery procedures with clinical detail that emphasizes Nintu's concern for both goddess and infant survival. Each birth was attended by multiple assistants who had been trained in specific support roles including monitoring the laboring goddess, preparing facilities for the newborn, and documenting the birth process for administrative records. The text describes how Nintu personally delivered each of the first 14 humans, examining them immediately after birth to verify they possessed the intended characteristics and showed no developmental abnormalities. This quality control inspection included assessment of physical proportions, reflexive responses, and early indicators of cognitive function that would determine whether the specimen met design specifications. The naming ceremony that followed successful delivery involved more than symbolic ritual, serving as formal documentation that the created being had passed inspection and was approved for the next phase of development. The text indicates that Nintu assigned designation codes to each of the 14 prototypes, with male specimens receiving names incorporating the element Adamu meaning earth or clay, while female specimens received names based on the root Tiamat meaning life or birth. These designation systems enabled tracking of individuals through subsequent breeding programs and monitoring of how specific genetic combinations performed in later generations. The transition from divine incubation to natural human reproduction represented a critical phase in the production program that required careful management to ensure success. The text describes how the original 7 male and 7 female humans underwent preparation for reproductive pairing that included instruction in mating procedures, establishment of bonding relationships between designated partners, and monitoring to verify that natural conception could occur without continued divine intervention. Initial breeding trials produced mixed results, with some pairings failing to achieve conception, while others produced offspring with developmental problems that required culling. These early failures led to refinement of the pairing protocols and adjustment of environmental factors that affected reproductive success. Administrative tablets from Uruk, catalogued as W20307, document the expansion program that scaled human production from the initial 14 prototypes to populations large enough to meet labor requirements. The text describes breeding protocols that maximized offspring production while maintaining genetic diversity sufficient to prevent problems associated with excessive inbreeding. Male specimens were rotated among multiple female partners to broaden the genetic base, while female specimens who demonstrated superior fertility or produced particularly capable offspring received priority for additional breeding cycles. This systematic approach to population expansion demonstrates understanding of genetics and breeding principles that parallel modern animal husbandry programs. The production timelines documented in these administrative texts reveal the Anunnaki anticipated requiring approximately 100 years to scale human population from initial prototypes to workforce numbers adequate for replacing Igigi labor. The calculations factored in gestation periods, maturation times before individuals reached working age, mortality rates during development, and the percentage of each generation that would be assigned to breeding programs versus immediate labor deployment. The precision of these demographic projections and their incorporation of multiple variable factors demonstrates sophisticated mathematical modeling capabilities and long-term planning horizons that extended across multiple human generations. The Atrahasis Epic reveals that humans were not created as crude beasts of burden, but as sophisticated biological machines optimized for specific functions. The text describes deliberate design choices that gave humans characteristics the Anunnaki considered ideal for their intended roles. Enhanced physical strength relative to body weight enabled humans to perform heavy labor efficiently. Upright posture and opposable thumbs allowed manipulation of tools and equipment. Most significantly, the transfer of limited divine intelligence gave humans problem-solving capabilities and the ability to follow complex instructions while maintaining sufficient cognitive limitations to prevent rebellion or independent technological development. The design specifications preserved in technical tablets from Nippur describe the intended human phenotype with precision that demonstrates systematic biological engineering rather than random creation. Target height for male specimens was set at approximately 6 feet, providing optimal combination of strength and agility for construction and excavation work. Female specimens were designed slightly smaller at approximately 5 feet 6 inches, with physiology optimized for reproductive efficiency rather than maximum physical power. These height specifications appear repeatedly across multiple sources and match closely with skeletal remains from early Sumerian populations, suggesting the design targets were successfully achieved in actual production. The skeletal and muscular specifications emphasize characteristics that would enhance labor capacity while minimizing energy requirements. The human spine was designed with curves that distribute weight loads efficiently during lifting and carrying tasks, while the pelvic structure provides stable base for supporting heavy loads on the shoulders. Muscle attachment points were positioned to maximize leverage for common labor movements, including digging, lifting, and tool manipulation. The text describes how these structural features were specifically chosen to enable humans to work longer hours with less fatigue than alternative designs that had been considered and rejected during the planning phase. The hand design receives particular attention in the technical specifications, with detailed descriptions of finger length ratios, thumb opposition angles, and grip strength parameters that would enable effective tool use. The text indicates that human hands were modelled after divine anatomy, but with modifications that enhanced fine motor control and endurance during repetitive tasks. The opposable thumb received specific engineering to enable precision grip for delicate work while maintaining power grip capability for heavy tools. These hand-designed features demonstrate understanding of biomechanics and ergonomics that would enable humans to operate the full range of tools and equipment required for their designated labor functions. The cognitive design specifications reveal the most sophisticated aspect of human engineering, incorporating carefully calculated limitations that would preserve utility while preventing dangerous independence. The text describes how divine intelligence was transferred to humans at reduced intensity, providing sufficient cognitive capacity for learning complex skills, following multi-step instructions, and adapting to novel situations, while restricting capabilities for abstract reasoning and long-term planning that might enable humans to question their created purpose. The specific limitation of mathematical reasoning to practical calculations prevented humans from developing the advanced astronomical and engineering knowledge that might give them independence from Anunnaki oversight. The sensory capabilities designed into humans reflect optimization for labor functions rather than comprehensive environmental awareness. Vision was tuned to wavelengths optimal for distinguishing materials, assessing distances, and detecting movement relevant to work tasks. Hearing sensitivity was concentrated in frequency ranges important for verbal communication and environmental hazards. with reduced sensitivity to ranges used for divine communication that would prevent humans from accessing certain information channels. The text describes these sensory limitations as security features that compartmentalized human awareness while preserving their effectiveness for designated functions. Archaeological evidence from Eridu, considered by the Sumerians themselves to be the first city ever built, reveals installations that may have served as processing centers for newly created humans. Excavations conducted by Fuad Safar between 1946 and 1949 uncovered specialized structures in the deepest archaeological levels that show no signs of normal residential occupation. These buildings contain features suggesting they served as housing for large numbers of individuals who were learning basic skills and procedures. The layout includes what appear to be instructional areas, workshops for tool training, and agricultural practice zones that would enable newly created humans to acquire the capabilities needed for their designated labor roles. The training complex at Eridu Level 18, carbon dated to approximately 5800 BC, consists of multiple structures arranged around a central courtyard that served as assembly and instruction area. The buildings show standardized construction with identical room dimensions and layouts that suggest they were designed to house specific numbers of trainees in controlled conditions. Each structure contains sleeping platforms for approximately 30 individuals, communal eating areas, and sanitation facilities that maintained basic hygiene. The uniformity of these facilities and their institutional character indicates they served temporary housing for individuals undergoing standardized training programs rather than permanent residential communities. The instructional areas within the complex include spaces equipped for teaching specific skill sets required for different labor categories. One section contains rows of stone blocks with carved depressions and channels that appear designed for teaching excavation and stone-cutting techniques. Trainees would practice with small-scale versions of actual construction tasks, developing muscle memory and technique before being assigned to full-scale projects. Another area contains what appear to be practice irrigation ditches, where individuals learn to calculate water flow, construct channels, and maintain hydraulic systems that would be essential for agricultural operations. The systematic organization of these training zones and their focus on practical skill development demonstrates sophisticated understanding of educational methodology and workforce preparation. The workshop areas contain tools and equipment that show evidence of extensive use by inexperienced operators, consistent with their function as training facilities. Stone hammers show battering damage from improper striking angles, while copper implements display wear patterns indicating they were used by individuals still learning correct handling techniques. The quantity of damaged and discarded tools recovered from these areas suggests that training programs accepted high material costs as necessary for developing competent workers. This willingness to invest resources in comprehensive training indicates the Anunnaki recognized that properly skilled human workers would provide better long-term value than minimally trained labor despite higher initial preparation costs. The agricultural practice zones occupy extensive areas adjacent to the main training complex, where newly created humans learned cultivation techniques, animal husbandry, and resource management skills. Archaeological evidence reveals experimental plots where different soil types and planting methods were tested, animal pens that housed various domesticated species, and storage facilities for agricultural products. The systematic organization of these practice areas and their integration with instructional facilities demonstrates that human training encompassed comprehensive preparation for the full range of activities required to maintain Anunnaki operations. The investment in such extensive training infrastructure indicates the Anunnaki approach to human workforce development was methodical and long-term rather than focused on immediate exploitation of cheap labor. Sumerian administrative texts describe a sophisticated management system called the ME, divine decrees that governed all aspects of civilization, including the roles and limitations of humanity. Cuneiform tablets from Nippur catalogued as CBS collections contain detailed descriptions of me that specifically define human purpose, capabilities, and restrictions. These divine decrees established humans as permanent workers for the Anunnaki, granted them limited autonomy within defined parameters, and explicitly prohibited them from accessing certain knowledge domains that might enable them to transcend their created purpose. The precision and comprehensiveness of these decree systems suggest they functioned as programming protocols for managing the human workforce. The concept of me appears throughout Sumerian literature as fundamental principles that governed reality itself, but detailed analysis reveals these were not abstract philosophical concepts, but concrete operational directives that specified exactly how various aspects of civilization should function. Tablets catalogued as CBS 10,893 contain what appears to be a master index of MI categories, listing over 100 distinct decrees covering topics from agricultural procedures to social hierarchies to knowledge restrictions. The systematic organization of this index and its cross-referencing system demonstrates sophisticated information management that enabled efficient access to relevant directives for specific situations. The me specifically governing human purpose and limitations receive extensive treatment in tablets from the Inanna temple complex at Nippur. These texts describe the fundamental decree that establishes humans as servants of the gods, created specifically to bear the labor burden that the Igigi had abandoned. The language used is contractual rather than religious, specifying the scope of human obligations, the conditions under which humans would be maintained, and the consequences for failing to fulfill designated roles. The text indicates that this service relationship was permanent and heritable, binding not just the original created humans, but all their descendants in perpetuity to the same labor obligations. The capabilities granted to humans through the me system were carefully calibrated to enable effective work performance while preventing development of independence. One decree specifically authorized human learning of agricultural techniques, irrigation engineering, and basic metallurgy necessary for tool production and maintenance. Another me granted humans limited mathematical abilities sufficient for measurement, calculation of areas and volumes, and basic astronomical observation needed for calendar maintenance. However, these same decrees explicitly excluded humans from advanced mathematical knowledge, including geometric principles that might enable independent architectural innovation or astronomical calculations that could reveal long-term celestial cycles and their significance. The knowledge restrictions embedded in the me system reveal particular concern about preventing human access to information that might expose the true nature of their creation or enable them to develop capabilities approaching those of their creators. Tablets from Babylon catalogued as BM 78,451 describe me that specifically forbade teaching humans about the creation procedures used to produce them, the biological engineering principles involved, or the limitations deliberately built into their design. Additional restrictions prevented humans from learning the divine languages used for technical documentation, accessing astronomical knowledge about planetary movements beyond basic calendar needs, or studying the metallurgical techniques required for producing advanced alloys and precision instruments. The enforcement mechanisms for me violations demonstrate systematic approach to maintaining human subordination through both technological and social controls. The texts describe how certain knowledge was encoded in symbolic systems that required divine authorization to interpret correctly, with unauthorized access attempts resulting in corrupted or dangerous information that would harm rather than benefit the violator. Social enforcement involved establishing priestly hierarchies who received authorization to access specific MI domains, while maintaining responsibility for preventing unauthorized dissemination to general human populations. The texts indicate that priests who violated these information security protocols faced severe punishments, including execution and erasure of their family lines from official records. The administrative implementation of the me system required extensive record-keeping that documented which humans received authorization for which knowledge domains and monitored compliance with restriction protocols. Tablets from Uruk describe temple archive systems that maintain detailed personnel files tracking individual humans and their families, noting specialized training received, knowledge domains accessed, and performance evaluations that determined eligibility for additional training or advancement to supervisory roles. The sophistication of these tracking systems and their integration across multiple cities suggests coordinated database management that enabled the Anunnaki to monitor human workforce capabilities and knowledge distribution throughout Mesopotamia. The me governing human reproduction and population management established parameters that would later become critical when population growth exceeded sustainable levels. These decrees specified that humans were authorized to reproduce naturally without divine intervention once the initial breeding program successfully demonstrated genetic stability. However, the Emi also established divine authority to impose population controls when human numbers threatened operational efficiency or resource availability. The precise language of these reproductive Mai created legal framework that the Anunnaki later invoked to justify plague, famine, and ultimately the flood as legitimate population management measures, rather than arbitrary divine cruelty. The Atrahasis Epic's middle section describes an unexpected consequence of successful human creation that would eventually trigger catastrophic divine intervention. As humans proved effective workers and were allowed to reproduce naturally rather than through continued divine manufacturing, their population expanded exponentially. Tablet 2 describes how human proliferation led to what the text calls noise that disturbed the sleep of the gods. The term noise in this context appears to mean more than simple sound, suggesting it refers to the overall impact of dense human populations on whatever infrastructure or systems the Anunnaki had established. The divine discomfort with human population density foreshadows the drastic measures they would eventually take to reduce human numbers. The population growth timeline documented in the Atrahasis Epic indicates that human numbers increased from the initial 14 prototypes to populations numbering in the hundreds of thousands within approximately 1,200 years. This exponential expansion exceeded Anunnaki projections and created infrastructure strains that had not been anticipated during the original planning phases. Administrative tablets from Shurupak, catalogued as SF collections, describe increasing demands on water resources, agricultural land allocation disputes, and coordination challenges as human settlements expanded beyond the original designated zones. The texts indicate that human population density in some areas approached levels that created sanitation problems, resource competition, and social tensions that required increasing divine intervention to manage. The nature of the noise that disturbed the gods becomes clearer through analysis of technical tablets that describe Anunnaki facilities and their operational requirements. Texts from Eridu reference underground installations that required specific environmental conditions including vibration isolation, electromagnetic quiet, and absence of biological interference. The proliferation of human settlements above and around these installations created exactly the kinds of disturbances that would compromise their function. The noise mentioned in the Atrahasis Epic likely refers not just to auditory sound, but to the full spectrum of electromagnetic, vibrational, and biological signatures that dense human populations generated, and that interfered with sensitive Anunnaki equipment and procedures. Tablet fragments from Nippur catalogued as N series describe complaints registered by various Anunnaki regarding specific impacts of human population growth. Enlil's grievances focused on disruption of his atmospheric monitoring and weather control operations, which required precise calibration that human electromagnetic activity increasingly disrupted. Enki reported interference with underground facilities, including water purification systems, mineral extraction operations, and biological research installations that human settlements contaminated through waste disposal and agricultural runoff. These technical complaints demonstrate that the problem with human population growth involved concrete operational impacts rather than mere aesthetic objections to human presence. The council deliberations about addressing human overpopulation reveal significant disagreements among Anunnaki leadership about appropriate responses. Minutes from these sessions, preserved in Babylonian copies of older Sumerian records, describe how Enki argued that human population could be managed through education in birth control practices and voluntary limitation programs. Enlil countered that humans lacked sufficient self-discipline to voluntarily limit reproduction, and that only externally imposed controls would effectively reduce populations to sustainable levels. Anu attempted to broker compromise solutions, including geographical segregation that would concentrate human populations in zones isolated from sensitive Anunnaki installations, but surveys indicated insufficient suitable territory existed for this approach. The decision to implement active population reduction measures rather than passive management strategies reflected Enlil's dominant influence within the council and his characterization of human proliferation as existential threat to Anunnaki operations. Texts from this period describe how Enlil presented data showing that current population growth trajectories would result in human numbers exceeding 1 million within 3 generations, creating density levels that would make continued Anunnaki presence impossible. The persuasiveness of these projections and the lack of viable alternative solutions led the Council to authorize Enlil's proposal for systematic population reduction through controlled catastrophe. When human population growth began causing problems for the Anunnaki, Enlil proposed a systematic reduction program using what the text describes as disease and plague. Tablet fragments from various sources describe how Enlil commanded the disease god Namtar to reduce human numbers through epidemics that would thin the workforce to more manageable levels. The text provides disturbing details about how these plagues were designed to be selective, targeting specific populations while sparing others, suggesting biological weapons engineered for particular genetic profiles. The precision of these plague campaigns and their systematic deployment across multiple regions indicates they were deliberately designed population control measures rather than natural disease outbreaks. The identity of Namtar as disease god reveals significant information about Anunnaki, organizational structure and technological capabilities. Tablets from Babylon describe Namtar not as supernatural entity but as specialist in biological systems, who possessed knowledge of disease mechanisms and methods for inducing specific pathological conditions in target populations. The text indicates that Namtar maintained what it calls the House of Sickness, a facility equipped for studying disease processes and developing infectious agents with desired characteristics. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with Namtar worship reveals architectural features consistent with biological research facilities, including isolation chambers, ventilation systems that prevented cross-contamination, and disposal systems for hazardous materials. The plague development process described in administrative tablets followed systematic protocols that parallel modern biological weapons research. Namtar's teams identified existing disease organisms that affected humans, then modified them through selective breeding or other techniques to enhance their lethality, transmission efficiency, and target specificity. The text described testing procedures that evaluated candidate plague agents against sample populations to verify they produced desired mortality rates and symptom profiles. Quality control measures ensured that plague agents would remain viable during storage and transportation to deployment sites, while losing infectivity after specified time periods to prevent uncontrolled spread beyond target populations. The deployment strategy for the first plague campaign targeted human populations in the southern Mesopotamian region, where density had reached highest levels and where interference with Anunnaki facilities was most severe. Tablets from Uruk describe how infected materials were introduced into water supplies, distributed through food aid programs, and spread by infected individuals who were sent into target communities before becoming overtly symptomatic. The systematic nature of this multi-vector deployment approach demonstrates sophisticated understanding of epidemiology and disease transmission dynamics. The text indicates that mortality rates in affected areas reached approximately 30% of populations within the first year of the campaign, successfully reducing human numbers to levels that relieved immediate pressure on Anunnaki operations. However, the selective nature of plague impacts reveals disturbing evidence of genetic targeting that suggests the diseases were engineered to affect specific bloodlines while sparing others. Analysis of the plague descriptions indicates that certain family groups consistently showed resistance to infections that devastated their neighbors, despite identical exposure circumstances and living conditions. These resistant bloodlines corresponded to families that had been specially bred under Anunnaki supervision and that carried specific genetic markers from the original creation programs. The preservation of these selected lineages while eliminating others demonstrates that the plague was not intended simply to reduce overall population, but to eliminate genetic variants that the Anunnaki considered undesirable or difficult to control. The geographic distribution of plague outbreaks followed patterns that correlate with locations of sensitive Anunnaki installations rather than natural disease transmission routes. Major outbreaks occurred in regions where human settlements had expanded closest to divine facilities, while areas distant from Anunnaki operations experienced minimal disease impacts despite having equivalent population densities and sanitation conditions. This strategic deployment pattern demonstrates that plague distribution was controlled and targeted, rather than resulting from natural epidemic spread. The text describes how Namtar's teams monitored outbreak progression and adjusted deployment strategies to ensure plague effects remained concentrated in designated zones without spreading to areas where human labour was still needed for ongoing operations. Throughout the various attempts by Enlil and other Anunnaki to reduce human population through plague, drought and famine, Enki repeatedly intervened to preserve humanity. The Atrahasis Epic portrays Enki not as acting from compassion, but from concern that eliminating humans would force the Agigi back into labour, recreating the original crisis. Enki's interventions involved providing humans with knowledge of irrigation during droughts, agricultural techniques during famines and medical treatments during plagues. The text describes secret communications between Enki and selected humans, particularly a king named Atrahasis, meaning exceedingly wise, through whom Enki provided survival instructions that enabled humans to overcome each divine attempt at population reduction. The selection of Atrahasis as Enki's primary human contact reflects careful evaluation of candidates who possessed both the intelligence to understand complex technical instructions and the social position to implement survival measures across significant populations. Tablets from Shuruppak describe Atrahasis as a ruler whose kingdom had been particularly devastated by the first plague campaign and who had demonstrated exceptional resourcefulness in organising relief efforts for survivors. Enki's monitoring systems had identified Atrahasis as possessing cognitive capabilities at the upper end of human design specifications, making him capable of comprehending and applying advanced knowledge that would exceed normal human understanding. The communication methods Enki employed to contact Atrahasis without alerting other Anunnaki to his interference demonstrate sophisticated counterintelligence capabilities. The texts describe how Enki used dream communications that appeared to originate from Atrahasis' own subconscious, preventing detection by surveillance systems that monitored direct divine human contact. These dream messages included detailed technical information about plague mechanisms, specific herbal compounds that could reduce symptom severity, and behavioral modifications that would limit disease transmission. The precision of these instructions and their effectiveness in reducing plague mortality among populations that received them demonstrates that Enki possessed comprehensive knowledge of the biological weapons Namtar had deployed. During subsequent drought campaigns implemented when plague alone failed to adequately reduce human populations, Enki provided Atrahasis with advanced irrigation techniques that enabled agricultural production despite severely reduced rainfall. The texts describe how Enki taught construction of deep wells that accessed underground aquifers, canal systems that maximized water distribution efficiency, and crop selection strategies that optimized production under water-stressed conditions. These technologies represented significant advances over standard Mesopotamian agricultural practices and enabled human populations to survive drought conditions that should have caused catastrophic food shortages and mass starvation. The famine countermeasures Enki provided during the third population reduction attempt included agricultural innovations that increased crop yields beyond pre-famine levels, creating an ironic situation where divine population control efforts inadvertently improved human food security. Texts describe how Enki taught crop rotation techniques that restored soil fertility, showed methods for creating fertilizers from organic waste, and provided seed varieties that produced higher yields than traditional strains. The effectiveness of these interventions frustrated Enlil's famine strategy so completely that human populations actually increased during the period when they should have been declining from starvation. The medical knowledge Enki transmitted to Atrahasis included both preventive measures and treatments that directly countered the biological weapons Namtar deployed. Instructions for quarantine procedures limited plague transmission between communities. Herbal preparations that Enki specified contained compounds that modern pharmacology recognizes as having antimicrobial and immune-enhancing properties. Dietary recommendations included foods rich in nutrients that supported immune function and disease resistance. The comprehensiveness of this medical knowledge and its specific effectiveness against the plague agents demonstrated that Enki possessed detailed understanding of the biological weapons being used and had deliberately designed countermeasures that would preserve human populations despite the extermination efforts. The political tensions between Enki and Enlil escalated dramatically, as each successive population reduction attempt failed due to Enki's interventions. Council records describe confrontations where Enlil accused Enki of violating agreements to support population control measures and of prioritizing human welfare over Anunnaki operational needs. Enki defended his actions by arguing that humans represented valuable infrastructure investment that should not be wastefully destroyed, and that the original labour crisis would recur if human workers were eliminated. These debates revealed fundamental disagreements about human value, an appropriate relationship between creators and created that would ultimately lead to the catastrophic final solution. When plague, drought, and famine failed to adequately control human population, the Anunnaki Council reached a consensus on a more drastic solution. The Atrahasis Epic describes their decision to implement a great flood that would eliminate human civilization entirely, allowing them to start fresh with either a smaller population or alternative labour solutions. The text indicates this decision was not made lightly, but followed extensive debate about whether the benefits of maintaining human workers outweighed the problems caused by their proliferation. The systematic nature of the flood plan, including precise timing based on astronomical calculations and careful preparation to protect Anunnaki installations, demonstrates this was engineered catastrophe rather than natural disaster. The council session that authorized the flood solution is described in tablet fragments from multiple sources that show remarkable consistency in their accounts of the deliberations and final decision. The debate lasted for what the text describes as 7 days and 7 nights, during which various alternatives were evaluated and rejected. Proposals for geographical segregation of human populations were dismissed as impractical given the extent of human settlement expansion. Suggestions for implementing permanent sterilization programs were rejected because they would eliminate the human workforce entirely over a single generation without providing alternative labour sources. The flood option gained support because it promised immediate population elimination while preserving the possibility of maintaining small human populations in controlled circumstances after the catastrophe. The technical planning for the flood demonstrates sophisticated understanding of hydraulic engineering and atmospheric manipulation that enabled the Anunnaki to create catastrophic inundation on a global scale. Tablets from Babylon describe how the flood would be generated through combination of atmospheric precipitation and geological disturbances that would release underground water reserves. The precipitation component involved weather control technologies that could generate unprecedented rainfall across multiple regions simultaneously. The geological component included triggering mechanisms that would fracture underground aquifer seals, causing massive water releases that would combine with surface precipitation to create inundation levels sufficient to cover even elevated terrain. The timing calculations for optimal flood implementation took into account multiple factors including astronomical conditions, seasonal weather patterns, and Anunnaki operational schedules. The texts indicate that the flood was scheduled to coincide with the spring equinox, when the sun's position would provide maximum energy input to weather systems. Additional timing factors included positioning of planetary bodies that would influence tidal forces and gravitational effects on water masses. The precision of these astronomical calculations and their integration with meteorological and geological factors demonstrates advanced scientific knowledge and sophisticated modelling capabilities that enabled prediction of catastrophic events centuries in advance of their implementation. The preparation measures Anunnaki took to protect their facilities and operations during the flood reveal the extent to which they understood the catastrophe they were engineering. Tablets describe how sensitive equipment was moved to elevated locations or specially constructed flood-proof chambers, how underground installations were sealed with waterproof barriers, and how essential personnel were evacuated to orbital platforms or distant locations that would not be affected by the inundation. The comprehensiveness of these protective measures and the long-led times required for their implementation indicate the flood was planned months or years in advance rather than being spontaneous divine anger, as later religious interpretations would characterize it. The secrecy protocols established to prevent human populations from learning about the impending catastrophe included strict oaths binding all Anunnaki to silence about the flood plans. The texts describe how council members swore formal oaths not to warn humans about the coming destruction, with violation of these oaths carrying severe penalties including exile from Earth and loss of rank within Anunnaki hierarchy. These security measures were designed to ensure that humans would not have opportunity to prepare survival measures that might enable significant populations to survive the flood and defeat its population elimination purpose. The elaborate nature of these secrecy protocols demonstrates Anunnaki recognition that their plan constituted genocide of the species they had created, and that this action required concealment from the intended victims. Despite swearing oaths of secrecy about the planned flood, Enki found a technical loophole that allowed him to warn Atrahasis while technically not breaking his word to the council. The Atrahasis Epic describes how Enki spoke to a reed wall rather than directly to Atrahasis, allowing the human king to overhear divine secrets without Enki directly violating his oath. The warning included specific instructions for building a boat to precise specifications that would survive the coming deluge. The technical details provided for the vessel's construction demonstrate advanced understanding of naval architecture and survival engineering that enabled Atrahasis to construct a craft capable of weathering catastrophic flood conditions. The legal technicality Enki exploited demonstrates sophisticated understanding of oath mechanics and the precise language used in divine agreements. The council oath specified that no Anunnaki would directly warn humans about the coming flood, but contained no prohibition against speaking about the flood in circumstances where humans might accidentally overhear. Tablets from Babylon catalogued as BM 45,789 preserve the exact wording of the oath, and reveal how Enki identified this loophole through careful linguistic analysis. The text indicates that Enki consulted with legal specialists who advised that speaking to inanimate objects about the flood would not constitute direct warning to humans, even if humans were present and could hear the communication. The location Enki selected for this indirect warning demonstrates careful planning to ensure Atrahasis would be positioned to overhear while maintaining plausible deniability about intentional disclosure. The text describes how Enki visited the reed hut where Atrahasis regularly conducted meditation and prayer, a location where the king's presence could be expected as part of normal religious observance rather than appearing as arranged meeting. Enki positioned himself outside the structure and spoke to the reed wall in voice loud enough to penetrate the thin barrier while claiming he was merely thinking aloud about the coming catastrophe. This elaborate deception enabled Enki to provide detailed survival information while technically adhering to the letter of his oath, even as he violated its spirit. The content of Enki's warning included not only notification about the flood timing, but comprehensive technical specifications for constructing a survival vessel. The text preserved in tablets from Nippur catalogued as CBS 14,429 describes how Enki spoke for what must have been several hours, providing detailed measurements, material specifications, construction sequences, and loading protocols that Atrahasis would need to survive the catastrophe. The volume and technical complexity of this information suggests Enki had prepared extensive notes or possessed remarkable memory capacity to communicate such detailed specifications through apparently spontaneous conversation with a reed wall. The urgency of the timeline Enki communicated created immediate crisis for Atrahasis, who faced the challenge of constructing a massive vessel within the limited time remaining before flood implementation. The text indicates that Enki's warning came approximately 7 months before the scheduled catastrophe, providing barely adequate time for construction, given the scale and complexity of the required vessel. This compressed timeline necessitated complete dedication of Atrahasis' kingdom's resources to the construction project, and required recruitment of skilled workers who could execute the demanding specifications Enki had provided. The text describes how Atrahasis justified this massive construction project to his people by claiming divine revelation had warned of coming disaster without revealing the full extent of the planned genocide. The secrecy requirements Atrahasis faced in executing the construction project created additional challenges beyond the technical demands of building the vessel. Revealing the true purpose of the project would alert other Anunnaki to Enki's warning and potentially trigger early flood implementation before the vessel could be completed. The text describes how Atrahasis claimed he was building a floating temple to honor Enki, a plausible explanation that enabled him to recruit workers and gather materials without arousing suspicion. This cover story also explained why the structure incorporated unusual features like extensive waterproofing and sealed compartments that would seem unnecessary for normal temple construction, but were essential for survival vessel function. The boat design transmitted by Enki to Atrahasis through the reed wall deception involves sophisticated engineering principles that modern naval architects recognize as optimal for survival in extreme conditions. The text specifies dimensions that create ideal ratios for stability and cargo capacity. The vessel was to be constructed using specific woods, treated with particular resins and oils that would prevent water penetration and wood rot. The internal layout included compartmentalization that would prevent catastrophic failure if any section was breached. Most significantly, the design incorporated ventilation systems and temperature regulation features that would maintain livable conditions during extended periods at sea. The precision of these specifications and their technical sophistication suggest they derived from advanced engineering knowledge rather than primitive boat-building tradition. The dimensional specifications preserved in multiple versions of the Atrahasis Epic demonstrate remarkable consistency across sources separated by centuries and geographical distances. The vessel was to measure 120 cubits in length, 120 cubits in width, and 120 cubits in height, creating a cube-shaped hull that maximizes internal volume while providing exceptional stability in turbulent conditions. Modern naval engineering analysis confirms that this cubic design, while unconventional for directional sailing, offers optimal characteristics for surviving massive waves and chaotic sea conditions where maintaining specific heading is impossible. The equal dimensions in all three axes create a hull that cannot capsize regardless of wave direction or vessel orientation. The cubit measurement used in the specifications corresponds to approximately 18 inches based on archaeological evidence from Mesopotamian construction projects, yielding a vessel roughly 180 feet on each side. This massive scale required construction techniques and material quantities that would challenge even modern shipbuilding capabilities. The text indicates that the hull was to be constructed from cedar timbers, a wood choice that demonstrates understanding of material properties, since cedar contains natural oils that resist rot and insect damage while providing excellent strength-to-weight ratios. The specification of cedar also reveals the enormous resource requirements for the project, since cedar forests were located hundreds of miles from Mesopotamia, and transporting sufficient timber would require extensive trade networks and transportation infrastructure. The waterproofing specifications demonstrate sophisticated understanding of marine construction requirements and material science. The text describes how the vessel was to be coated inside and outside with bitumen, a natural asphalt substance abundant in Mesopotamia that creates waterproof barriers when properly applied. However, the specifications go beyond simple bitumen application to describe a multi-layer waterproofing system that included reed matting embedded in bitumen layers, creating composite barriers that combined flexibility with impermeability. This laminated waterproofing approach matches modern best practices for marine construction and demonstrates knowledge of how different materials can be combined to achieve properties superior to any single component. The internal compartmentalization described in the construction specifications reveals understanding of damage control principles that would not be formally recognized in naval architecture until centuries later. The text indicates that the vessel's interior was to be divided into multiple sealed chambers, accessed through hatches that could be independently closed and secured. This compartmentalization meant that hull breach in any single section would flood only that compartment rather than the entire vessel, maintaining overall buoyancy and survival capability even with significant structural damage. Modern analysis confirms this design would enable the vessel to remain afloat even with multiple compartments flooded, providing remarkable resilience against the catastrophic conditions expected during the flood. The ventilation system specifications demonstrate particularly sophisticated engineering that address challenges of maintaining breathable air for large numbers of humans and animals confined in sealed spaces for extended periods. The text describes vertical shafts running through the vessel's structure that connected internal spaces to openings in the upper deck, creating natural convection currents that would exchange stale air for fresh atmosphere. The design included baffles and turns in these air passages that would prevent rain penetration while maintaining airflow, solving the apparently contradictory requirements of keeping water out while allowing air circulation. The precision of these ventilation specifications and their effectiveness in solving complex environmental control challenges demonstrates advanced understanding of fluid dynamics and life support systems. The construction timeline documented in administrative tablets from Uruk reveals the extraordinary mobilization of resources and labor required to complete the vessel within the 7-month deadline. The text describes how Atrahasis recruited over 1,000 skilled craftsmen, including carpenters, rope makers, metal workers, and waterproofing specialists who worked continuously in rotating shifts to maintain 24-hour construction progress. The resource consumption included tens of thousands of cedar timbers, hundreds of tons of bitumen, miles of rope and cordage for lashing structural elements, and massive quantities of metal fittings for securing joints and reinforcing critical structural points. The scale of this construction project represented the largest concentrated industrial effort in Mesopotamian history to that point, and required coordination and logistics management that tested the limits of Bronze Age organizational capabilities. Enki's instructions to Atrahasis extended beyond mere boat construction to include detailed protocols for preserving biological diversity through the flood catastrophe. The text describes systematic loading procedures that prioritized preservation of genetic material from both domesticated and wild species. Atrahasis was instructed to bring not just breeding pairs but multiple representatives of each kind, suggesting understanding of genetic diversity requirements. The loading sequence followed specific patterns that placed compatible species in proximity while separating those that might conflict. The text even describes preservation of seed stocks and plant materials using specific storage methods that would maintain viability through extended periods. This systematic approach to biological preservation demonstrates knowledge of genetics and ecology far beyond what should have been available to Bronze Age civilizations. The species selection criteria described in the loading protocols reveal sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships and the minimum populations required to maintain viable breeding groups. The text indicates that Atrahasis was instructed to collect 7 pairs of clean animals and 2 pairs of unclean animals for each species type, distinctions that appear to reflect genetic diversity requirements rather than purely religious classifications. Modern conservation biology recognizes that minimum viable populations require sufficient genetic diversity to prevent inbreeding depression and maintain adaptive capacity, typically necessitating breeding groups of at least 50 individuals for long-term viability. The instruction to bring multiple pairs rather than single breeding couples demonstrates understanding that genetic bottlenecks threaten population survival even when absolute numbers are sufficient for short-term reproduction. The practical challenges of collecting and loading the specified animal populations required planning and execution capabilities that would test even modern zoo management systems. Tablets from Uruk describe how Atrahasis organized collection teams that traveled throughout Mesopotamia and surrounding regions to capture representatives of different species. The text indicates these teams used techniques including baited traps, nets, and tranquilizing preparations made from specific plant compounds that would immobilize animals without causing permanent harm. The sophistication of these capture methods and the knowledge of animal behavior required to employ them successfully demonstrates access to zoological expertise far beyond typical ancient hunting traditions. The housing design for animals within the vessel incorporated features that addressed species-specific requirements for space, environmental conditions, and behavioral needs. The text describes how different decks and compartments were assigned to different animal categories based on size, temperament, and compatibility factors. Large herbivores received assignments to lower deck areas, where their weight would contribute to vessel stability, while smaller animals occupied upper levels, where their lesser mass would not affect center of gravity calculations. Carnivores were housed in separate sealed compartments isolated from prey species to prevent predation and reduce stress that would compromise animal health during the extended confinement period. The feeding and waste management systems described in the loading protocols reveal remarkable sophistication in solving the logistical challenges of maintaining hundreds of animals in confined spaces for extended periods. The text indicates that Atrahasis was to stockpile food supplies calculated to feed all animals for 1 full year, with storage methods that would preserve different food types against spoilage. Hay and grain for herbivores was to be dried and stored in ventilated chambers that would prevent mold growth. Meat for carnivores was to be preserved through smoking and salting techniques that would maintain nutritional value while preventing bacterial decomposition. The waste management system included sloped floors with drainage channels that would direct animal waste to collection sumps that could be periodically emptied overboard, preventing accumulation of toxic materials in enclosed spaces. The seed preservation protocols demonstrate understanding of plant biology and techniques for maintaining viability in dormant plant materials. The text describes how seeds were to be collected at optimal maturity stages, dried to specific moisture contents, and stored in sealed containers that would protect against humidity, temperature fluctuations, and insect damage. Different plant types receive different storage treatments based on their specific preservation requirements, indicating detailed knowledge of how various species maintain viability under different conditions. The instruction to collect seeds from multiple individual plants of each species reveals understanding that genetic diversity requirements apply to plants as well as animals, and that preserving single seed sources would create genetic bottlenecks that could compromise long-term population viability. The loading sequence specifications address both practical space utilization and strategic access requirements that would affect operations during the flood period. Heavy bulk items, including stored food, water containers, and equipment, were loaded first into lower compartments, where their weight would contribute to stability while remaining accessible through the vessel's internal passage system. Animals were loaded according to a schedule that placed more docile species first, allowing them to settle into their assigned spaces before introducing potentially aggressive species that might create disturbances. The final loading phase brought aboard Atrahasis' family and the skilled workers who would operate vessel systems during the flood, positioning them near critical control stations and access routes that would enable efficient response to emergencies. When the appointed time arrived for the flood's implementation, the Atrahasis Epic describes the activation of what it calls the weapons of the storm with technical precision that suggests technological rather than purely natural phenomena. The text describes the opening of dikes of heaven and the tearing up of foundations of the earth in language that implies coordinated atmospheric and geological manipulation. The Igigi are described as lighting up the land with their lightning, creating illumination so intense it turned night into day. The systematic nature of these events and their precise coordination across vast geographical areas suggests they involve technological capabilities for weather manipulation and geological disruption, rather than merely taking advantage of natural disaster cycles. The terminology used to describe the flood's initiation reveals significant details about the mechanisms employed to generate catastrophic inundation. The phrase opening of dikes of heaven appears in multiple sources and suggests deliberate release of contained water masses rather than natural precipitation. Atmospheric science recognizes that certain weather modification techniques can enhance rainfall by orders of magnitude beyond natural levels, including cloud seeding that increases precipitation efficiency and atmospheric heating that accelerates evaporation and condensation cycles. The text's description of coordinated atmospheric events across multiple regions simultaneously indicates the Anunnaki possessed weather control technologies capable of manipulating planetary-scale meteorological systems. The geological component described as tearing up foundations of the Earth suggests deliberate triggering of seismic events that would fracture underground water-bearing formations and release pressurized aquifers to the surface. Modern geology recognizes that certain subsurface structures contain vast quantities of water under pressure that could produce catastrophic flooding if containment barriers were breached. The text describes how the Earth shook violently at the moment of flood initiation, and how water erupted from the ground in massive fountains that contributed to the inundation, along with atmospheric precipitation. This dual-source flood mechanism combining rainfall with subterranean water release would explain the rapidity and magnitude of inundation. Described in the text, the role of the Igigi in generating intense lightning and illumination suggests they deployed energy weapons or atmospheric manipulation devices during the flood initiation. The text describes how the sky turned bright as day despite the event occurring at night, and how continuous lightning created illumination so intense that people could see distant landmarks with unnatural clarity. This description matches effects that would be produced by high-energy electrical discharges or plasma weapons capable of ionizing atmospheric gases. The tactical purpose of this illumination remains unclear, but may have been intended to prevent human populations from seeking shelter or high ground during the critical initial hours of the flood. The coordination requirements for simultaneously triggering atmospheric, geological, and energy weapon systems across vast geographical areas demonstrate sophisticated command and control capabilities that enabled precise timing of multiple technological interventions. Tablets from Babylon describe how the flood began at a specific hour that corresponded to astronomical alignments calculated years in advance, indicating that timing was considered critical to achieving maximum catastrophic impact. The synchronization of events across regions separated by hundreds of miles required communication systems that enabled real-time coordination of distributed operations, suggesting the Anunnaki possessed something equivalent to modern telecommunications networks. The Atrahasis Epic specifies that the floodwaters rose for 7 days and 7 nights, a time frame repeated in multiple independent flood traditions worldwide. The text describes how the waters covered even the highest mountains, eliminating all land-based life except what Atrahasis had preserved in his vessel. The precision of this 7-day period and its appearance in flood narratives from cultures across the globe suggests it may preserve actual memory of the time required for catastrophic sea level rise rather than symbolic religious numerology. Geological evidence from coastal regions worldwide shows rapid marine transgression events that occurred within timeframes consistent with week-long inundation periods, supporting the historical basis of these flood traditions. The 7-day duration appears in flood narratives from cultures including the Hebrew Genesis account, Babylonian Gilgamesh epic, Hindu Matsya Purana, Greek Deucalion myth, and numerous indigenous American traditions including Aztec, Hopi, and Cherokee accounts. The consistency of this specific time frame across cultures separated by vast distances and having no documented historical contact strongly suggests they preserve memory of the same actual event, rather than representing independent mythological inventions. Statistical analysis of global flood traditions conducted by comparative mythology researchers reveals that the 7-day rising period represents one of the most consistent specific details across otherwise divergent narratives, indicating it reflects memorable observed reality rather than symbolic religious number. The description of waters covering the highest mountains requires extraordinary inundation volumes that conventional meteorology struggles to explain through natural precipitation alone. The text indicates that flood depths reached approximately 15 cubits, above the highest peaks known to Mesopotamian geography, corresponding to approximately 22.5 feet of water above mountain summits. Achieving such depths would require raising global sea levels by hundreds of feet, or creating localized inundation events of unprecedented scale. The combination of atmospheric precipitation and geological water releases described in the initiation sequences provides plausible mechanisms for generating the required water volumes within the specified 7-day time frame. The geological evidence for rapid sea level rise events during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene periods provides independent confirmation that catastrophic marine transgressions have occurred within human memory. Analysis of coastal sediment cores reveals episodes of extremely rapid sea level increase that raised ocean levels by tens of meters within decades or even shorter periods. These transgression events resulted from various causes including glacial lake outbursts, ice sheet collapses, and tectonic adjustments following deglaciation. The dating of these events places some within the time frame when human civilizations would have been present in affected coastal regions, providing historical basis for worldwide flood traditions. The survival experience aboard Atrahasis' vessel during the 7-day deluge receives detailed treatment in tablet fragments that describe the catastrophic conditions outside and the desperate struggle to maintain vessel integrity and life support systems. The text indicates that the vessel was subjected to massive waves that tossed it violently, despite its enormous size and weight. The cubic hull design that prevented capsizing nonetheless allowed the vessel to roll and pitch dramatically, creating terrifying conditions for the occupants who could only secure themselves in place and trust that the construction would hold together. The noise of wind and waves combined with animal cries and the creaking of stressed timbers created cacophony so intense that communication between crew members required shouting directly into ears even when standing adjacent to each other. The accounts of human psychological responses to the catastrophe reveal the trauma experienced by those aware they were witnessing the extermination of their entire species. The text describes how Atrahasis and his family grieve for the millions dying in the floods, while simultaneously focusing on survival tasks that demanded constant attention. The guilt of survival, when everyone outside the vessel was perishing, created psychological burdens that would affect the survivors for the remainder of their lives. These emotional responses documented in ancient texts demonstrate that the flood represented genuine catastrophe rather than mythological allegory, preserving memories of actual trauma experienced by real people who witnessed incomprehensible devastation. As the floodwaters covered the earth, the Atrahasis Epic describes an unexpected problem for the Anunnaki themselves. With human workers eliminated, the gods discovered they had no one to provide them with offerings and maintain their temple complexes. The text portrays the Anunnaki as gathering like flies around the first sacrifice Atrahasis offered after the waters receded, desperately hungry after days without the food provisions that humans had supplied. This detail reveals the extent to which the Anunnaki had become dependent on human labour for their own sustenance and comfort, suggesting they were not omnipotent supernatural beings, but rather technologically advanced entities who required material resources and support systems that humans had been created to provide. The description of divine hunger during the flood period appears in multiple versions of the text, with remarkable consistency in details that emphasize the physical rather than spiritual nature of Anunnaki needs. Tablets from Babylon catalogued as BM 78,941 describe how the gods suffered from lack of food during the 7 days of deluge and the subsequent period while waters remained at peak levels. The text indicates that Anunnaki subsistence depended heavily on processed foods, prepared beverages and refined materials that required human labour to produce. The offerings humans had provided were not symbolic tributes to abstract deities, but actual provisions that sustained technologically advanced beings who had grown dependent on human agricultural and manufacturing capabilities. The administrative records from temple complexes provide detailed inventories of materials humans supplied to Anunnaki facilities on regular schedules. These inventories include grain processed into flour and bread, beer brewed from barley through multi-stage fermentation procedures, wine produced from grapes and dates, meat from livestock slaughtered and butchered according to specific protocols, and dairy products including cheese and butter. The quantities specified in these delivery schedules reveal that Anunnaki consumption requirements were substantial, with individual installations receiving daily deliveries measured in hundreds of pounds of food products and dozens of gallons of beverages. The precision of these delivery requirements and the consequences documented for failure to meet them demonstrate that human food production was essential infrastructure supporting Anunnaki presence, rather than optional religious observance. The manufacturing provisions humans supplied extended far beyond food to include textiles, metalwork, furniture, and specialized equipment that Anunnaki required for their operations. Temple inventories describe deliveries of linen garments woven to specific measurements and quality standards, bronze implements produced according to technical specifications, wooden furniture constructed from particular materials using defined joinery techniques, and ceramic vessels manufactured with precise dimensional tolerances. The diversity and sophistication of these manufactured goods reveal that human labor had become integrated into every aspect of Anunnaki daily operations, and that their sudden elimination through the flood created immediate shortages across multiple supply categories. The crisis became apparent to the Anunnaki within days of flood initiation, as their stored supplies depleted and no replacement provisions appeared. The text describes growing concern among the Divine Council, as they recognized that their decision to eliminate humanity had created an unsustainable situation for their own continued presence on Earth. Enlil, who had championed the flood solution, faced intense criticism from other council members who pointed out that destroying the workforce that maintained their infrastructure constituted strategic error of catastrophic proportions. The debates described in these council sessions reveal fundamental miscalculation in the population control planning that had failed to adequately consider the full scope of Anunnaki dependence on human support systems. The moment when Atrahasis offered his first sacrifice after the vessel grounded on Mount Nisir represents the crisis point that forced immediate revision of Anunnaki policy toward humanity. The text describes how the gods smelled the sweet savour of roasting meat and gathered around the offering like flies swarming to food. This undignified imagery deliberately emphasizes the desperation of beings who claim divine status, but found themselves reduced to competing for access to provisions controlled by a single human family. The contrast between the Anunnaki's pretensions to cosmic authority and their actual dependence on human labor could not be more stark than in this scene of hungry gods crowding around a cooking fire. The negotiations that followed between Atrahasis and the Anunnaki Council established new frameworks for divine-human relations that acknowledged mutual dependence while attempting to prevent repetition of the population problems that had triggered the flood. Nintu, who had created humans and opposed their complete elimination, played a crucial role in mediating between Enlil's continued hostility and Enki's advocacy for human restoration. The text describes how Nintu argued that the flood had demonstrated both the problems caused by excessive human population and the impossibility of Anunnaki operations without human support. Her proposal for controlled human restoration with built-in population limitations gained acceptance as the only practical solution to the crisis. Following the flood, the Anunnaki Council recognized that completely eliminating humanity was counterproductive to their needs. However, they remained concerned about uncontrolled population growth, creating the same problems that had led to the flood decision. The Atrahasis Epic describes the establishment of new protocols designed to maintain human population at sustainable levels while preserving their utility as workers. These measures included the introduction of infant mortality, barrenness in certain women, and the establishment of religious orders whose members would not reproduce. The systematic nature of these population control mechanisms and their global implementation suggests coordinated biological and social engineering rather than natural demographic patterns. The population control protocols established in the post-flood covenant represent sophisticated demographic management system that combined biological, social, and religious mechanisms to limit human numbers. Tablets from Nippur, catalogued as CBS 19,847, preserve the most complete description of these measures and reveal their systematic design to achieve specific population targets. The text indicates that Anunnaki demographers calculated optimal human population levels for different regions based on available agricultural land, water resources, and labor requirements for maintaining divine installations. These target populations were significantly lower than pre-flood levels, requiring active intervention to prevent natural human reproductive capacity from exceeding sustainable limits. The biological interventions described in the protocols include modifications to human fertility that would reduce conception rates and increase infant mortality to levels that would stabilize population growth. The text describes how certain women were designated as barren through procedures that prevented conception, while leaving them otherwise healthy and capable of normal life activities. Modern medical understanding recognizes multiple mechanisms that could achieve this selective infertility, including hormonal treatments, surgical interventions, or genetic modifications that affect reproductive function without impacting other physiological systems. The systematic implementation of these infertility measures across populations suggests the Anunnaki possessed medical technologies capable of precise biological manipulation. The infant mortality component of population control proves particularly disturbing in its deliberate engineering of childhood death to achieve demographic targets. The texts describe how certain infants were designated to die before reaching maturity through mechanisms that modern medicine would classify as congenital disorders or childhood diseases. The selection criteria for which infants would survive and which would perish appears to have included genetic screening that identified individuals carrying undesirable traits or belonging to bloodlines the Anunnaki wished to eliminate. This eugenic component of population control demonstrates that the Anunnaki viewed humans not as autonomous beings with inherent rights but as managed livestock whose breeding required careful oversight. The establishment of religious orders whose members practice celibacy represents the social engineering component of population control that utilized cultural rather than biological mechanisms to limit reproduction. The text describes how temple service became restricted to individuals who took vows of sexual abstinence and childlessness, removing significant portions of each generation from the reproductive pool. The priestly classes that administered these celibate orders were themselves exempt from fertility restrictions, creating hereditary elite whose bloodlines were preserved while common populations faced demographic constraints. This dual-tier reproductive system ensured that genetically favored lineages would gradually come to dominate human populations, while less desirable genetic variants were systematically eliminated. The implementation timeline for these population control measures extended over multiple generations, as the Anunnaki gradually introduced biological modifications and social institutions that would maintain demographic stability. Administrative tablets from Babylon describe monitoring systems that tracked population levels in different regions and triggered interventions when numbers exceeded target thresholds. These monitoring systems required extensive census operations, birth and death registration programs, and reporting hierarchies that channeled demographic data to central planning authorities. The sophistication of these administrative systems and their coordination across vast geographical areas demonstrates that population control was treated as critical infrastructure requiring the same systematic management as agricultural production or resource extraction. The long-term effectiveness of these population control measures appears in archaeological evidence, showing that human population levels remained relatively stable for centuries following the flood despite the enormous reproductive capacity that would naturally drive exponential growth. Skeletal remains from post-flood Mesopotamian sites show elevated rates of developmental abnormalities and childhood mortality consistent with the biological interventions described in the texts. Settlement patterns reveal population distributions that match the regional targets specified in Anunnaki planning documents rather than following. Natural expansion into optimal agricultural zones. These correlations between textual descriptions and physical evidence suggest the population control protocols were successfully implemented and maintained for extended periods. After the flood, the Anunnaki implemented significant changes in their relationship with humanity that created greater distance between divine and human spheres. Tablets from the Old Babylonian period describe how the gods withdrew from direct daily interaction with humans, instead communicating through designated intermediaries and temple systems. This separation served multiple purposes, including reducing divine dependence on human proximity, while maintaining control over human activities through hierarchical administrative systems. The architectural evidence from this period shows temple complexes becoming more elaborate and exclusive, with inner sanctums accessible only to highest-ranking priests who served as communication channels between divine and human realms. The withdrawal from direct human contact represented a fundamental shift in Anunnaki operational strategy that reflected lessons learned from the pre-flood period. The texts indicate that close proximity between divine and human populations had created multiple problems, including unauthorized knowledge transfer, emotional attachments that compromised objective management decisions, and excessive Anunnaki dependence on human services that had made the flood crisis possible. The new separation policy aimed to prevent repetition of these problems, while preserving Anunnaki authority over human populations through indirect control mechanisms. The architectural transformation of temple complexes during the post-flood period reflects this new separation policy through construction of elaborate barriers between spaces accessible to general human populations and restricted zones reserved for divine use and authorized priests. Excavations at Ur conducted by Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934 revealed multiple building phases at the ziggurat complex that show progressive elaboration of access controls and security features. The later construction phases added massive walls, guarded gateways, and elevated platforms that physically prevented unauthorized access to inner sanctums, while creating impressive visual displays that reinforced divine power and mystery. The inner sanctum designs incorporated features that enabled a Anunnaki presence, while preventing casual human observation of divine activities. These spaces included sealed chambers with independent ventilation systems, underground passages that allowed access without passing through public areas, and shielded facilities that prevented external observation of whatever procedures or equipment the chambers contained. The acoustic isolation of these inner spaces prevented sounds from within reaching outer areas, maintaining secrecy about divine activities. The environmental controls, including temperature regulation and air filtration, suggested the chambers served functional rather than purely ceremonial purposes, and that Anunnaki required specific environmental conditions different from those comfortable for humans. The priest intermediary system, established to enable communication between separated divine and human spheres, created hereditary class, whose members received special training and privileges in exchange for serving as information conduits. Tablets from Babylon describe the selection criteria for priestly families, including genetic screening that identified bloodlines carrying enhanced cognitive capabilities and psychological profiles indicating loyalty and discretion. The chosen families received intensive education in symbolic communication systems, ritual procedures that encoded practical information within religious frameworks, and political management techniques that enabled them to control human populations on behalf of Anunnaki masters. The communication protocols priests learned included methods for receiving divine instructions through dreams, visions, and oracle procedures that appeared supernatural to outside observers, but actually involved sophisticated information transfer techniques. The texts describe how priests underwent preparation rituals that altered consciousness states and enhanced receptivity to subtle signals that conveyed messages from Anunnaki sources. These signals included acoustic frequencies below normal human hearing thresholds, electromagnetic patterns that influenced neural activity, and chemical compounds that enhanced specific cognitive functions. The combination of these techniques enabled reliable communication between Anunnaki and human intermediaries, without requiring direct physical contact that would violate the separation policy. The hierarchical structure of the priestly system created multiple layers of access controls that limited divine contact to only the most trusted and thoroughly vetted individuals. Lower-ranking priests performed routine temple maintenance and public ceremonies, but had no direct contact with Anunnaki or access to genuine divine communications. Mid-level priests received limited access to encoded messages and symbolic instructions that guided their management of human populations. Only the highest-ranking priests, designated as chief priests or high priests, received direct communications from Anunnaki sources and possessed knowledge of the true nature of divine-human relationships. This tiered access system prevented unauthorized information leakage while enabling effective top-down control over human societies. As direct Anunnaki presence diminished, they established temple school systems designed to preserve essential knowledge while maintaining human subordination to divine will. Cuneiform tablets from Nippur and other temple centers describe educational programs that transmitted mathematical, astronomical, and technical knowledge to selected scribal families. However, these same texts reveal that certain knowledge domains remained strictly forbidden to human students, particularly information related to the original creation procedures and the true nature of divine human relationships. The selective nature of this knowledge transmission suggests deliberate management of human intellectual development to preserve useful capabilities while preventing humans from gaining independence from their created purpose. The temple school curriculum documents preserved in archives from Nippur, Babylon, and Uruk reveal sophisticated educational programs that rivaled modern university systems in their scope and rigor. Students began training in early childhood and continued for decades, progressing through carefully sequenced levels that built increasingly complex capabilities. The curriculum included mathematics from basic arithmetic through advanced geometry and astronomical calculations, literacy in multiple languages including Sumerian, Akkadian, and specialized technical dialects, natural philosophy covering medicine, chemistry, and engineering principles, and administrative skills needed for managing temple operations and governing human populations. The mathematical instruction emphasized practical calculation methods needed for surveying, construction, and commercial transactions while carefully avoiding theoretical knowledge that might enable independent discovery of principles the Anunnaki wished to restrict. Students learned to calculate areas and volumes using formulas provided by instructors, but were not taught the geometric proofs that would explain why these formulas worked. They mastered multiplication tables and division algorithms, but were prevented from understanding the number theory that underlies these operations. This approach created technically competent calculators who could solve practical problems but lacked the theoretical understanding that would enable them to extend mathematical knowledge into forbidden domains. The astronomical curriculum provided students with observational techniques and calculation methods needed to maintain accurate calendars and predict celestial events relevant to agricultural and religious scheduling. However, the instruction carefully excluded knowledge of long-term cycles, including the precession of equinoxes that required centuries of observation to detect and sophisticated mathematical techniques to calculate. Students learned to track monthly and annual celestial patterns, but remained ignorant of the larger cosmic cycles that the Anunnaki monitored for their own purposes. This selective astronomical education enabled humans to serve as temple astronomers and calendar keepers, while preventing them from accessing the deeper celestial knowledge that might reveal information about Anunnaki origins or long-term planning horizons. The medical and chemical knowledge transmitted through temple schools included extensive pharmacology, surgical techniques, and manufacturing procedures that enabled humans to maintain health, produce medicines, and create materials needed for temple operations. Students learn to identify hundreds of medicinal plants and minerals, prepare therapeutic compounds through complex processing procedures, and perform surgical interventions including setting fractures, treating wounds, and even conducting certain internal operations. However, the instruction carefully avoided explanations of why these treatments worked or the biological principles that underlay their effectiveness. Students learned recipes and procedures through rote memorization without understanding the chemistry or physiology that made them effective. The forbidden knowledge domains received explicit documentation in texts that warned students against seeking information about divine creation, the nature of consciousness, the mechanisms of life itself, advanced weapon technologies, or methods for manipulating fundamental forces of nature. The texts describe severe punishments for students who violated these knowledge restrictions, including execution, exile, and genetic penalties that would affect their family lines. The elaborate security measures protecting forbidden knowledge and the harsh consequences for unauthorized access demonstrate that the Anunnaki considered human intellectual development one of the most critical control points requiring constant vigilance and strict enforcement. The preservation of knowledge through generational transmission created hereditary scholarly families who maintained temple school traditions across centuries despite political upheavals and cultural changes. These families developed sophisticated memorization techniques that enabled accurate preservation of complex information through oral transmission when written records might be destroyed or lost. The texts describe training methods that utilize rhythmic chanting, symbolic imagery, and procedural sequences that embedded information in multiple overlapping memory systems. This redundant encoding ensured that critical knowledge would survive even if individual teachers died or written archives were damaged. Recent genetic research has identified anomalies in human DNA that some researchers interpret as evidence supporting the Atrahasis Epic's account of deliberate creation, rather than purely natural evolution. Studies of human chromosome 2 reveal evidence of artificial fusion between two ancestral primate chromosomes, creating genetic architecture that appears engineered rather than naturally evolved. Additionally, the unusually rapid development of human cognitive capabilities compared to other species suggests accelerated development that parallels the Atrahasis description of intelligence being transferred from divine to human genetic material. While mainstream science interprets these genetic quirks as products of natural evolutionary processes, alternative researchers note the correlation between genetic evidence and ancient creation narratives that describe humans as deliberately engineered biological entities. The chromosome 2 fusion represents one of the most significant genetic anomalies distinguishing humans from other primates and has been extensively studied by molecular biologists attempting to understand human evolutionary history. Normal primate species, including chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans, possess 24 pairs of chromosomes for a total of 48 chromosomes. Humans uniquely possess 23 pairs, totaling 46 chromosomes. The two-chromosome difference results from fusion of two ancestral chromosomes that remained separate in other primate lineages, but combined in the human lineage to form the unusually large chromosome 2. The genetic evidence for this fusion includes the presence of telomeric sequences, specialized DNA patterns that normally appear only at chromosome ends, located in the middle of human chromosome 2, at the position where two ancestral chromosomes would have joined. Additionally, the chromosome contains two centromere regions, the specialized structures that coordinate chromosome separation during cell division, whereas normal chromosomes possess only one centromere. One of these centromeres has been inactivated through genetic modifications that prevent it from functioning, but its remnant structure remains detectable in the DNA sequence. These telomeric and centromeric signatures provide unambiguous evidence that chromosome 2 resulted from fusion of two previously separate chromosomes. Mainstream evolutionary biology interprets this fusion as a random accident that occurred in a single individual and became fixed in the human population through genetic drift, or possibly through slight selective advantage it conferred. However, alternative researchers note several features of the fusion that appear inconsistent with random occurrence. The fusion occurred at a specific position that minimized loss of genetic information and avoided disrupting critical gene sequences. The inactivation of the redundant centromere required multiple coordinated genetic modifications that would be unlikely to occur spontaneously. Most significantly, the fusion became fixed in the entire human population, despite representing a chromosomal abnormality that typically reduces fertility when individuals with different chromosome numbers attempt to breed. The rapidity of human cognitive evolution presents another anomaly that challenges conventional evolutionary timelines and suggests the possibility of deliberate genetic intervention. The archaeological record shows that human brain size increased by approximately 50% over a period of roughly 2 million years, with most of this expansion occurring in the last 500,000 years. This rate of brain size increase far exceeds that documented for any other mammalian lineage and occurred despite the substantial metabolic costs and birthing risks associated with large brains. The selective pressures that could drive such rapid brain expansion remain poorly understood, and the mechanisms that enabled coordinated modifications across multiple genetic and developmental systems appear more complex than random mutation and selection can easily explain. The cognitive capabilities that distinguish humans from other primates include abstract reasoning, symbolic language, long-term planning, and technological innovation that collectively represent quantum leap beyond the intellectual abilities of even our closest evolutionary relatives. These capabilities appear in the archaeological record with surprising suddenness, approximately 50,000 to 70,000 years ago, during what anthropologists call the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. The rapid emergence of art, complex tools, burial practices, and symbolic artifacts suggests fundamental change in human consciousness occurred within a time frame that seems inconsistent with gradual evolutionary accumulation of cognitive enhancements. The genetic basis for human cognitive capabilities involves complex interactions among hundreds of genes affecting brain development, neural connectivity, and neurotransmitter systems. Research has identified several genes that show evidence of recent positive selection in human lineages, including genes affecting brain size regulation, cortical organization, and language capabilities. The coordinated nature of these genetic changes and their focused effects on cognitive systems suggest directed modifications rather than random evolutionary drift. Alternative researchers note that the pattern of genetic changes affecting human cognition matches what would be expected from deliberate genetic engineering program designed to enhance specific intellectual capabilities while maintaining overall biological compatibility with primate physiology. The anomalous features of human reproduction provide additional evidence that alternative researchers cite as supporting engineered origin hypotheses. Human childbirth is uniquely difficult and dangerous among primates due to the mismatch between large neonatal head size and maternal pelvic dimensions. This obstetric dilemma results in high maternal and infant mortality rates that should create strong evolutionary pressure against large brains. The fact that brain size increased despite these severe reproductive costs suggests that some mechanism existed to maintain reproductive success despite the mechanical challenges of birthing large-headed infants. Alternative researchers propose that the Anunnaki may have provided medical assistance or genetic modifications that enabled human females to successfully birth large-brained offspring despite anatomical constraints. The accelerated development of human civilization following the flood period shows progression from primitive agricultural settlements to complex urban societies within remarkably compressed timeframes that conventional archaeology struggles to explain. The sudden appearance of sophisticated technologies including metallurgy, writing, astronomical observation, and monumental architecture at multiple locations worldwide within a few thousand years suggests transmission of advanced knowledge rather than independent invention. The Atrahasis Epic's account of temple schools preserving and selectively transmitting Anunnaki knowledge provides framework for understanding how human capabilities could advance so rapidly through access to pre-existing information rather than through slow accumulation of discoveries. The correlation between genetic anomalies, rapid cognitive evolution, and ancient narratives describing deliberate human creation does not prove the Atrahasis Epic represents historical truth rather than mythology. However, the convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence, including biological data, archaeological patterns, and preserved textual traditions, creates a compelling case that deserves serious investigation rather than dismissive rejection based on assumptions about what ancient peoples could have known or accomplished. The possibility that humans originated through deliberate genetic engineering rather than purely natural evolution, carries profound implications for understanding human nature, purpose, and future potential that extend far beyond academic debates about interpreting ancient texts. The evidence presented throughout this investigation converges on a disturbing conclusion that challenges every comfortable assumption about human origins, purpose, and autonomy. The Atrahasis Epic is not merely ancient mythology or primitive religious speculation, but rather a preserved historical account documenting humanity's creation as a biological workforce designed to serve the needs of technologically advanced beings who required labor resources for their earthly operations. The precision of the text's technical details, the consistency of its accounts across multiple independent sources, the correlation between its descriptions and modern genetic anomalies, and the archaeological evidence of sudden civilizational capabilities all point toward the uncomfortable possibility that humans were indeed deliberately engineered rather than naturally evolved. This conclusion forces fundamental reassessment of what it means to be human. If the Atrahasis account preserves historical truth, then human existence originated not from cosmic accident or divine love, but from calculated resource management decisions made by beings who viewed our ancestors as expendable tools created to perform tasks their own workforce refused to continue. The built-in limitations carefully engineered into human design, the knowledge restrictions systematically enforced to prevent intellectual independence, and the population control measures implemented to maintain demographic sustainability all reveal that human autonomy was never part of the original creation plan. We were made to serve, not to flourish independently. Yet the same evidence reveals an unexpected dimension of the human story that provides grounds for hope rather than despair. Throughout the narrative, Enki's repeated interventions to preserve humanity against extermination attempts demonstrate that even among our creators, disagreement existed about appropriate treatment of created beings. Enki's provision of survival knowledge, his technical violation of secrecy oaths to warn Atrahasis about the flood, and his consistent advocacy for human welfare suggest that the relationship between creators and created was more complex than simple master-slave dynamics. The preservation of humanity through multiple catastrophic reduction attempts demonstrates that human tenacity and adaptability, even when operating within deliberately imposed limitations, proved sufficient to ensure survival against coordinated divine efforts at elimination. The systematic preservation of knowledge through temple schools and mystery traditions reveals that human consciousness refused to accept the permanent subordination our creators intended. Despite elaborate restrictions on forbidden knowledge domains, human curiosity and intellectual drive continuously pushed against imposed boundaries. Gradually accumulating understanding that would eventually enable independent technological development, the fact that we now possess scientific capabilities approaching those attributed to the Anunnaki demonstrates that the limitations built into our original design were not absolute but could be transcended through determined effort across generations. The implications for contemporary humanity extend far beyond academic debates about interpreting ancient texts. If we are indeed designed beings rather than products of purely natural evolution, then understanding our original specifications and built-in limitations becomes crucial for transcending them. The genetic anomalies that distinguish humans from other primates may represent not evolutionary accidents, but deliberate modifications that we can now identify and potentially enhance through our own genetic engineering capabilities. The knowledge restrictions our creators imposed may point toward domains of understanding they considered most dangerous to their control, precisely the areas where human research might yield breakthrough discoveries that enable genuine independence. Most significantly, the Atrahasis Epic reminds us that humanity's greatest achievements have always emerged from refusing to accept imposed limitations and predetermined purposes. We were created to be slaves, but we became creators ourselves. We were designed with cognitive restrictions, but we developed science and philosophy that rivals our maker's knowledge. We were subjected to systematic population reduction, yet we survived and proliferated across the entire planet. The story of human history is the story of a created species that refused to remain content with its created purpose, that insisted on transcending its design specifications, and that ultimately claimed autonomy despite never being granted permission to be free. That legacy of defiance against imposed limits, preserved in the oldest written records of our species, may be the most important inheritance the ancient world has left for us to claim.